What if the next major geopolitical rupture wasn't in the South China Sea, not in Ukraine, not in the Middle East, but right here in North America? What if the most stable alliance in the Western world just entered its most serious crisis in decades? Because when Donald Trump declared economic war on Canada, many expected political theater. What they did not expect was Mark Carney's response, and that response may have changed the strategic equation entirely. Let's unpack what's really happening. This confrontation didn't begin with military threats, it began with tariffs. Sharp, direct, deliberate. Trump announced sweeping trade measures targeting key Canadian exports, particularly energy, raw materials, and industrial goods. The justification sounded familiar: protecting American workers, defending domestic production, correcting trade imbalances. But this time, the rhetoric carried a sharper edge. Canada was accused of exploiting trade rules, of benefiting disproportionately from U.S. access, of failing to align fully with American strategic priorities. In other words, comply or face consequences. Now, for viewers outside North America, this may sound routine, but it's not. The United States and Canada share one of the deepest economic relationships on the planet. Every single day, roughly $2 billion in goods and services cross that border. Supply chains are not separate, they are integrated. A car assembled in Michigan may cross the Canadian border multiple times before completion. Electricity powering New York State flows from Canadian grids. U.S. refineries depend on Canadian crude. Canadian industries rely on American components. This is not a normal bilateral relationship. It's an economic ecosystem. And ecosystems are fragile. Weaponizing trade within that ecosystem isn't just leverage, it's structural risk. Now, here's where the story shifts, because when Trump escalates, most leaders respond emotionally. Press conferences, nationalist rhetoric, escalatory threats. But Mark Carney is not most leaders. Carney is a financial architect, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, the man who helped stabilize the UK after Brexit, a central banker who navigated the 2008 global financial crisis. He understands systemic shock. And instead of reacting politically, he responded strategically. His statement was calm, measured, technocratic. But beneath the calm tone was a seismic shift. He made three core points. First, Canada would defend its economic sovereignty without hesitation. Second, retaliatory measures were not hypothetical. They were being designed. Third, and most important, Canada would accelerate diversification away from overdependence on the United States. That last point is the real earthquake, because diversification is not a tweet. It's a multi-year strategic pivot. And if Canada follows through, the implications are massive. Let's break that down. Canada is one of the world's largest energy exporters. Oil, natural gas, hydropower, uranium. Historically, the majority flows south. But Europe is energy hungry, especially after reducing dependence on Russia. Asia needs critical minerals for electric vehicles and semiconductors. The Indo-Pacific region is restructuring supply chains away from China. Canada sits on enormous reserves of lithium, nickel, cobalt, materials central to the green energy transition. If Ottawa accelerates export infrastructure toward Europe and Asia, if new LNG terminals are prioritized, if critical mineral partnerships expand with Japan, South Korea, Germany, the U.S. gradually loses its privileged position, not overnight, but incrementally. and incremental shifts reshape power balances more effectively than sudden ruptures. Now let's talk about the domestic political dimension. Trump's strategy is rooted in leverage. His worldview is transactional. Allies are valuable, but only if they align fully with U.S. interests. If they don't, pressure is applied. Tariffs, sanctions, negotiation by escalation. It worked before. Under his previous administration, NAFTA was renegotiated into USMCA. Steel tariffs pressured multiple allies. China was forced into trade talks. The assumption is simple. America's market power is so dominant that partners will eventually concede. But Canada is not China. It's not Mexico. It's not an adversary economy. It's culturally and institutionally intertwined with the United States. And that's why this confrontation is more delicate. Because if you pressure an adversary, you expect resistance. If you pressure your closest ally, you risk trust erosion. And trust, once damaged, is difficult to restore. Carney understands that dynamic. He's not trying to win headlines, he's trying to change incentives. By signaling long term diversification, he shifts the conversation from immediate retaliation to structural independence. And markets listen carefully to signals like that. After his remarks, analysts began revising long term North American trade assumptions. Energy futures showed volatility, currency markets reacted, business leaders quietly began reassessing exposure. Because investors hate one thing above all, uncertainty between stable partners. Now zoom out further. This moment occurs in a fragile global environment. The war in Ukraine continues to drain Western resources. China is testing boundaries around Taiwan. Middle Eastern tensions fluctuate unpredictably. Global debt levels are historically high. Inflation remains politically sensitive in nearly every developed economy. Western unity is already under pressure. A fracture inside North America compounds that instability. And adversaries are watching. Beijing watches closely for signs of Western fragmentation. Moscow benefits from alliance tension. If Washington and Ottawa appear divided, it subtly weakens NATO cohesion. Even if this dispute is purely economic, its symbolism matters. Because geopolitics is not only about tanks, it's about perception. Now, here's another layer most people are missing: energy security. The United States imports significant amounts of Canadian crude oil daily. Refineries in the Midwest are specifically configured for Canadian heavy crude. Replacing that supply is not simple. Switching suppliers requires logistical adjustments. Infrastructure changes, cost increases. If trade tensions escalate and energy becomes politicized, U.S. consumers feel it. Gasoline prices are politically radioactive. Carney doesn't need to threaten an energy cutoff. He only needs to introduce doubt. Doubt alone affects markets. And Trump faces his own calculation. Escalation energizes parts of his domestic base. Standing firm against perceived trade imbalances plays well politically. Projecting strength reinforces his brand, but prolonged instability risks economic backlash. And economic backlash influences elections, so both sides are operating within tight constraints. Now let's examine the strategic endgame scenarios. Scenario 1: controlled de escalation. Back-channel diplomacy resolves tariff disputes. Both sides declare victory. Structural relationship remains intact. This is the most likely short term outcome. Scenario 2: managed diversification. Canada proceeds with trade expansion quietly. The U.S. maintains periodic leverage. Relationship cools but doesn't rupture. Power gradually redistributes. Scenario 3: Escalation spiral, tariffs expand, retaliation widens, energy becomes politicized, markets price in sustained instability. At that point, investors demand higher risk premiums for North American assets. Borrowing costs rise, growth slows, political tension deepens. No one wins. But miscalculations happen. History shows that economic conflicts sometimes escalate unintentionally. Because once national pride enters the equation, flexibility narrows. Carney's approach aims to avoid emotional escalation. Trump's approach thrives on confrontation. It's a clash of governing philosophies. One leader believes strength is displayed through pressure. The other believes strength is displayed through strategic repositioning. And the global audience is studying this carefully. If Canada successfully reduces dependence without major economic damage, other U.S. allies may consider similar hedging strategies. Diversification is not rebellion, it's insurance, and insurance reduces leverage. That's why this moment is larger than tariffs. It's about long term influence. For decades, access to the U.S. market has been the ultimate bargaining chip. If that chip weakens, Washington's global economic dominance softens, not collapses, but softens. And geopolitics operates in margins. Now, here's the psychological dimension. For generations, Americans and Canadians assumed stability was automatic. Borderless travel, shared defense, integrated economies. The idea of economic confrontation feels unnatural. That psychological shift alone has consequences. Businesses become cautious, governments become hedged, trust becomes conditional, and conditional trust reshapes alliances. We're not witnessing tanks rolling across borders. We're witnessing something quieter: strategic recalibration. If Carney succeeds, this will be remembered as the moment Canada began redefining its global posture. If Trump doubles down and secures concessions, it reinforces the doctrine of leverage politics. Either way, the old assumption of frictionless alignment is gone. And that's the true headline. Not war, but transformation. So here's a real question. Is this temporary turbulence? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a post automatic alliance era, where even the closest partnerships are conditional and strategic? Because if that's the case, North America just entered a new chapter. And once strategic recalculations begin, they rarely reverse completely. This isn't about outrage, it's about incentives. It's about supply chains, energy grids, capital flows, political risk. It's about who can endure pressure longer and whether economic ecosystems can survive political experimentation. The world is watching closely because when the United States pressures China, that's rivalry. When it pressures Canada, that's redefinition. And redefinition changes the global map. So the next time you hear, it's just tariffs, remember this: tariffs can trigger negotiations, but they can also trigger structural shifts. And structural shifts alter power quietly, gradually, permanently. This story isn't over. In many ways, it may just be beginning.